Hello, and thank you for joining us for this evening's session. And it's a part of global reflection series that Institute Social carries. And Institute Social is a think tank based in Istanbul, Üsküdar, and we are all happy to get you together this evening with a distinguished professor from United States. My name is Professor Dr. Hatice Fernodabaşı, and our guest's name today is Professor Dr. Jennifer Lansford. And Jennifer Lansford is a distinguished developmental psychologist and is a leading expert in families, child, and adolescent development. And Professor Lansford is a professor at Duke University. She has conducted extensive research on how cultural and social contexts shape parenting practices and influence children's emotional, social, and cognitive development. In her presentation, she will explore parenting in different cultural contexts with a particular focus on fatherhood and boyhood as a way of understanding the influence of gender in family life and child development. And we hope that you will all enjoy this session and encourage. And please do not hesitate to ask questions via chat part and question and answers. Okay, thank you. And the floor is yours, Professor Lansford. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight. I am grateful for that. And I'll be focusing on fatherhood and boyhood. So here's a bit of our plan for today. I'll start by talking about some theoretical perspectives on studying fatherhood and boyhood in different cultural contexts. Then I'd like to talk about an overview of some methods and select findings from two different projects, including UNICEF's Multiple Indicator Cluster Surveys and the Parenting Across Cultures project. And then I'll talk throughout about implications for parenting interventions and policies, including the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'll say that today I'll be going into not much detail, but covering a lot of ground. So we'll focus on kind of some breadth rather than depth of any of these things. But I have publications that are reporting in full findings from the various things that I'll be talking about today. So if on the last slide, I'll have my email address. And so you can certainly feel free to email me if you would like me to follow up by sending you publications that go into more detail on any of the things that I'll be talking about today. So there are some key parenting tasks that apply across different cultural contexts. These include providing warmth, affection, and cognitive stimulation to children, and socializing children in a way that promotes desired behaviors. The way that parents go about doing these things may differ across different cultural contexts, and so we'll go into some explanations about how that might work. But these key parenting tasks also change as children develop. So in infancy, some especially important parts of parenting are things like responsiveness and forming attachment relationships between the infant and the parent. During early childhood, so this would be kind of the preschool years, scaffolding children's activities to promote self-regulation and emotion socialization are important. Then in middle childhood, kind of into the school years, behavioral control becomes important. So things like discipline. In adolescence, as adolescents are spending less time in the direct company of parents and more time in the company of peers, things like more distal forms of monitoring and psychological control become important. So, so this is true for both mothers and fathers, that kind of what parents do and the ways that they go about doing that change as children develop. I also want to just say early on that parents are situated in entire family systems. So parent-child relationships, of course, are important, but relationships between parents are also important. Relationships between siblings are important, as are extended family relationships with grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins and things like that. So I'll be talking today mostly about parent-child relationships, but I just want to note that families are entire systems of relationships, and that what's happening in one set of relationships within a family may spill over into others and affect other relationships. So, in other words, for example, what's going on between parents can also spill over into what's going on between parents and children. I also want to just note that we sometimes think about parents affecting children, and that certainly happens. But these are also reciprocal and transactional processes. So not only do parents affect children, but children also affect parents. And so if you think about these two children, one a child who's kind of having a temper tantrum and is very angry, versus a child who's behaving very sweetly, you can clearly think about how parents would react differently to children who are behaving in these different ways. And children who are misbehaving are more likely to elicit harsh parenting, for example, than are children who are not misbehaving, which sets up these kinds of reciprocal transactions where um, child misbehavior can provoke harsher parenting, but then harsher parenting can also provoke more child behavior problems. In terms of thinking about parenting in global perspective, parents in all countries share goals of rearing their children to be successful, competent members of society. But what parents believe is necessary and how they behave to achieve their goals varies around the world. So, this two by two matrix gives a little bit of an explanation about why it's important to study parenting and child development in different cultural contexts. You can have the same behavior that might carry different meanings in different cultural contexts. So, to give an example of that, something like direct eye contact is used by some parents in some cultures to establish communication with a child. And so, you might hear parents say things like, "Look at me when I'm talking to you," and then that direct eye contact establishes that the parent and child are engaging with each other. Whereas in other cultural contexts, the parents would discourage direct eye contact because that would be perceived as a sign of disrespect or even aggression. There are also, kind of on the flip sides, the same behavior or different behaviors may have the same or different meaning depending on the cultural context. So it's important for children all over the world to feel loved and accepted and valued by their parents. But the specific behaviors that parents use to convey love and affection may differ in different cultural contexts. So, for example, in some cultural contexts, parents would hug or kiss their children or say, "I love you" as forms of love and affection. Whereas you wouldn't see those direct displays in some cultures, but instead would have more indirect forms of affection. A parent preparing a special type of food for the child, or something that clearly conveys to the child that the child is loved and accepted, but isn't saying that directly. So, with those kinds of background perspectives in mind, I'll talk about the first of the two overall studies that I'll be talking about today. UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster surveys are nationally representative and internationally comparable household surveys that have been implemented by governments, UNICEF, and partners in 7 waves of data collection from 1995 to the present. These surveys are still ongoing. And the work that I'll talk about today from this is taken from a monograph published by the Society for Research in Child Development that was focused on gender differences and similarities in child growth and mortality, parental caregiving, family discipline and violence, and child labor. So this slide shows countries that provided data on discipline, which is the part of the findings from this study that I'm going to focus on today. So the countries are grouped here according to the Human Development Index, ranging from countries high on the Human Development Index, which is a composite that focuses on life expectancy, um, education, and kind of gross domestic product within countries. There are also medium HDI countries and low HDI countries represented in these data. So in terms of measures that specifically had to do with discipline, households with a child between the ages of 2 and 4 years were included here. This included more than 35,000 households. Half of the kids who were being reported on were boys, and 32 countries were represented in this work. So caregivers were asked whether they or anyone in their household had used each of 11 forms of discipline with the target child in the last month. And then a 12th item asked whether the caregiver believes that to bring up or raise or educate the target child properly, it's necessary to punish him or her physically. And so what you see here on this slide is a graph that compares boys and girls on these um, 11 different forms of discipline. And the main thing to take away from this slide is that the dark bars are for girls, the lighter bars are for boys. And you can see that there are slight gender differences, but not big enough gender differences as to be very meaningful. So, on most of these indicators, caregivers are reporting using more of each form of discipline with boys than with girls, but again, only slightly more so. Um, Parents are slightly more likely to use only nonviolent discipline with girls, and slightly more likely to use corporal punishment, psychological aggression, physical violence with boys than with girls. But again, the differences are very small here. Um, and so overall, this is a story that has to do more with gender similarities than with gender differences. And this was largely true for the other aspects that were examined in terms of gender differences between boys and girls in a number of different aspects of caregiving, including things like cognitive stimulation, things like talking with the child, helping the child to count or name things. This was also true in terms of socio-emotional forms of caregiving. Um, uh, and the biggest gender differences were found in terms of child labor, especially within the home. So girls were typically, and again, this is across countries, girls were on average asked to do more chores at home than boys were. But in general, this large study of many thousands of households in dozens of countries showed more gender similarities than differences. Now, one thing it's important to note here, I think, is that these were young children, and in some countries there are more gender differences that emerge between boys and girls once children become adolescents than there are earlier in childhood. But so turning back to kind of the specific piece about using corporal punishment. Across countries, these 32 countries, almost a third of caregivers believe that corporal punishment is necessary to raise a child properly. But the range across countries here was very large, ranging from 4% of parents to 94% of parents within a given country reporting that they think it's necessary to use corporal punishment to rear a child. Um, so that's a big range, but across all variables, child gender differences were small. Here, I want to say a little bit about differences between beliefs and behaviors, because fewer caregivers believed that it was necessary to physically punish children than actually did so. So, for example, only 5% of caregivers in Montenegro believed that using physical punishment was necessary, but 47% reported that they had spanked their child in the last month. And so this suggests that if there are beliefs and practices related to physical punishment that are really different, that physical punishment is maybe being used in an emotional rather than an instrumental manner, that parents may be sort of lashing out because they are not sure what else to do instead. This shows this big difference in several countries. So the blue bar here shows whether caregivers reported using any form of corporal punishment with their child in the last month. And the reddish kind of bars show whether one or both parents believe that corporal punishment is necessary. So in general, you can see a big discrepancy between beliefs and the need to use corporal punishment and whether parents are using corporal punishment. So this is connected, I think, in an important way to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that are guiding the International Development Agenda through 2030. So this slide shows all 17 of the goals, um, but there's a specific target that's part of Sustainable Development Goal 16 related to peace and justice, that explicitly aims to eliminate violence against children, and corporal punishment is one of the specific targets there. So, as part of this goal of achieving peace, justice, and strong institutions, um, many countries are outlawing corporal punishment. So, as of March of 2025, corporal punishment is outlawed by 67 countries and is one means by which countries are trying to realize this specific target goal of ending abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against and torture of children. And you can see from this little graph here that in 1979, Sweden was the first country to outlaw all forms of corporal punishment. And then the growth has been exponential, especially in recent years, and is now up to 67 countries. Um, this slide shows using data from the Parenting Across Cultures project, and I'll talk more about that study in a minute, but data from both before and after a legal ban that happened in Kenya. And so I want to illustrate this because sometimes people will ask, well, do these legal changes actually affect parents' behavior? And this suggests yes. So Kenya in 2010 outlawed corporal punishment. And Kenya is the bar that's at the very top of here. So you can see that when kids were age 8, on average, parents in Kenya were using more corporal punishment than parents in the other countries that were involved in this study: Italy, the Philippines, Thailand, the United States, Colombia, and Jordan. But around this place where you see kind of an elbow, if you will, and a big drop off in corporal punishment, that's the year that Kenya outlawed corporal punishment. And so by comparing that change in Kenya with the changes in the other countries that didn't have a corresponding legal change, it suggests that the legal change really may have had an impact in Kenya. You'd expect that parents across all the countries would be using less corporal punishment as their children get older, and you do see that. This has a limitation because this was parent reports, and so parents may have been more reluctant to report something that was against the law. Um, in which case, this kind of graph may overstate the decrease, but nonetheless, I think it's promising.
May I
So
ask a question here,
yes,
Professor?
definitely.
Yes. Is this corporal punishment outlaw related to human development indexes?
It is related to the the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most widely ratified human rights convention ever. It's now been ratified by all countries except the United States, which is it is a terrible thing that the United States hasn't ratified that. But the Human Development Index is a little bit separate. The Human Development Index is another United Nations index that's related to education, income, and life expectancy in a given country. But and I'm sorry if I may have misunderstood the question, but it is
Eh,
actually,
Yeah.
sorry.
Because you said that Sweden got it in 1970s, and then we have 65 more countries. So was that relevant, this, kind of outlawing the corporal punishment? Was that related to the country's human development indexes? Was that important?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So, especially early on, countries that were higher in the Human Development Index were some of the earlier countries to outlaw corporal punishment. Um, but nowadays, now that more countries have outlawed corporal punishment, whether countries have outlawed corporal punishment is less strongly related to the Human Development Index. Um, some countries, like the early countries that outlawed corporal punishment, Sweden, Norway, Finland, already had changing beliefs about corporal punishment that let the laws in those countries be passed. But more recently, a lot of countries have been passing these laws with the goal of changing beliefs about corporal punishment, with the idea that by outlining something, countries convey a message about how acceptable that behavior is. And so I think that's kind of what you're seeing increasingly with the countries that are now outlining corporal punishment.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And I should pause. Are there any other questions that anyone wants to raise at this point before I move on?
Not at this point.
Okay. Definitely feel free to jump in with other questions. Um, so to tell you a little bit more about the Parenting Across Cultures sample, there were 9 countries, or still are 9 countries involved in parenting across cultures: the United States, Colombia, Italy, Sweden, Jordan, Kenya, Thailand, the Philippines, and China. And we began by recruiting a sample of 8-year-old children and their mothers and fathers in these 9 countries in 2008. And we've been following these families ever since then. So the original children are now 24, 25 on average. And we've collected data annually from those families, and more than 4 times a year during the COVID years. So this is part of our research team when we were meeting in person recently. And we've met as an international team over the years in each of the 9 countries participating in the project, which has been great to, sometimes we've had a chance to meet some of the families who are participating in the project, and have got to be good friends as well as colleagues over the years. So, in terms of our data collection, we have procedures that involve translation of the measures from whatever the original language they're in into the target language, and then we back translate the measures to be able to check for any difficulties or in the translation or cultural adaptation of the measures. We get informed consent from all of the participants. Ethics committees review the procedures in each of the 9 countries. And so, as I mentioned, we've been conducting these annual interviews since 2008. So we have a lot of data on these children and their parents. So here are a couple of families who've given permission for us to share pictures. And so here's this family at the beginning of the study, and then 10 years later, and we're now even beyond 10 years. So we've really we have a lot of information on watching these kids grow up over these years. So this slide, the important thing to take away from this slide is that because we have individual family members, so children, mothers, and fathers nested within families, nested within countries, we're able to sort of parse out different sources of variance and a number of different aspects of parenting and child development. So this slide just shows a whole list of different variables that we've measured over time. And what this shows is when we look at kind of how much variance is accounted for by individual factors versus cultural level factors, we find a lot more variability within countries than between countries, which I think is really interesting because sometimes we think about how different things can be across different cultural contexts, and that's true. But there are also a lot of similarities between countries and a lot of variability within countries that might be related to things like child gender, parent gender, um, uh, socioeconomic status, things like that. So, in this particular special issue of the journal Parenting, Science, and Practice, this was we've had separate papers from each of the 9 countries, plus a cross-national concluding paper, and we were focused on differences and similarities between mothers and fathers' attributions and attitudes related to parenting in each country. So, the idea here is that parents hold different beliefs about childhood and child rearing that influence their parenting practices and guide their relationships with their children. So, we had measures of one called the parent attribution test that basically asked parents for explanations regarding successes and failures in different caregiving. Like if something is going well in your relationship with your child, is that because you're a good parent, because you have an easy child, because you're lucky? Um, as well as when things aren't going well. Is it because the child is tired? Is it because you're upset? What? So, kind of asking parents to say why things are going well or not well in their relationships with their children. And then we had what's called the parental modernity inventory that asks about parents' progressive and more authoritarian attitudes about child rearing and education. So, if in terms of fathers and mothers' attitudes and attributions, mothers in general across countries reported more progressive attitudes than fathers, and fathers reported more authoritarian attitudes than mothers. Authoritarian attitudes would be things like saying that the child must obey, or needs to be obedient, giving the child kind of less freedom to make decisions or choices than mothers do. That's part of the kind of the gender difference between mothers and fathers here. Um, Mothers and fathers' attributions and attitudes were moderately correlated across countries, meaning that there was some similarity within families in mothers and fathers' beliefs about successes and failures in caregiving situations, and in their attitudes that were either kind of authoritarian or more progressive. Um, Except in Kenya, mothers and fathers reported more progressive than authoritarian attitudes. So in Kenya, there was kind of a lean toward having more authoritarian attitudes than in the other countries. I'll talk a little bit about warmth and control because these are aspects of parenting that are central to many theories of parenting. Warmth includes affection and acceptance and is typically universally positively valued as a dimension of parenting. Control involves more physical and psychological verbalizations and behaviors that are intended to change the child's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And control is more variable across cultures in terms of whether that's a good or a bad thing. Um, so if you look at just the correlation between warmth and control, this correlation differs significantly across countries. So here's a chart that shows a range of correlations between warmth and control. Um, so warmth, just to give you some samples, would be things like showing love and affection toward the child. Control would be kind of making sure the child does what he or she is supposed to do. Um, um, Setting limits on children's behaviors. The reason there's a range here is that we had mothers' perspectives, fathers' perspectives, children reporting about their mothers, children reporting about their fathers. And so that's why you see a range. But I think the important thing to note here is that in some countries, especially Kenya, there's a strong positive correlation between warmth and control, meaning that both children and mothers and fathers who report that they're warm and loving toward their children are also reporting that they're pretty controlling. Whereas in some countries, there's even a negative association between those variables. So in Jordan, Sweden, and the United States, for example, there are some kids and parents who are saying that if the more loving and warm they are, the less controlling they are. So I think this is interesting and sort of speaks to the difference. Different implications that control in particular has across different countries. Here, I want to just show you some longitudinal associations between warmth and externalizing behavior. Externalizing behavior would be acting out behavior, things like aggression um, and delinquency, things like that. Warmth, again, is this loving and accepting behavior. And so here, what you see is traced over time. Time one would be about when kids are 8 years old. Time two would be about when kids are 9 years old, and so forth. And so you're seeing over time there's stability in both children's behaviors and parents' behaviors. So kids who are highly aggressive when they're 8 are also highly aggressive when they're 9 and when they're 10, and so forth. And parents who are warm when their child is 8 years old are also warm when their child is 9 years old and 10 years old. But these cross lag paths that go from externalizing to warmth and from warmth to externalizing show that, for example, kids who at 8 years old are have more externalizing problems, have parents who when they're 9 years old are less warm, and then when parents are less warm when the child is 9 years old. The children are misbehaving more, have more externalizing behavior problems when they're 10 years old. So this is getting at some of the reciprocal and transactional, bidirectional associations between parenting and child behavior that I mentioned early on. These relations are just about identical for mothers and fathers and for boys and girls. So again, here, this is really a story more of gender similarities than differences, both for children, boys and girls, and for parents, mothers and fathers. Here's an example of a measure that gets at hostile attribution biases. So one question is, well, why do kids behave aggressively? And so one explanation for that is kids whose parents are harsher elicit more aggressive behavior from their kids. And kids who are aggressive tend to have more hostile attribution biases. So kids are presented with a story. These stories are tweaked a little bit across cultural contexts to make sure that they're culturally relevant. But in this story, the child is in the lunchroom at school. You've just gotten your tray. You're walking to a table. Someone drops you or bumps you and you drop your tray. Your food is spilled all over the floor. And then kids are asked, do you think that the boy bumped your arm on purpose or by accident? So kids who say that the boy bumped them on purpose, that's a hostile attribution because here there's not really enough information to know if this is happening um, by accident or on purpose. But if you think that someone did something mean to you on purpose, you're more likely to have an aggressive response, which is what's shown in this slide. And this is across all 9 countries in the Parenting Across Cultures project. And it shows that in all 9 of these countries, if a child makes a hostile attribution, saying that someone did something mean to them on purpose, they're more likely to say that they would behave aggressively than if they make a benign attribution. And this is important because it suggests kind of an entry point for trying to work with kids, especially who are aggressive, to teach social skills and do some coaching on reframing thinking to avoid hostile attributions that would perpetuate aggressive behaviors. This is a slight shift to talking about intergenerational pathways to parent rejection around the world. And so we had G1 refers to, in this case, the grandparent generation, if you will. G2 is generation 2, that refers to the parent generation, and G3 refers to generation 3 or the child generation. And so we asked parents in our study to report on their own parents' acceptance and rejection when they were children. So here, this is fathers in this case would be saying, okay, remembering when I was a kid, my mother was rejecting or not, or my father was rejecting or not. And then they completed the same measure about whether they were rejecting with their own children. And children likewise completed these measures about whether their parents currently were accepting or rejecting. And so you see that fathers, for example, who perceived their own parents during childhood as being rejecting, were more likely to be rejecting of their own children. Um, and um, and the children then, in those cases, when fathers were rejecting, had more behavior problems. One interesting thing, though, was that this intergenerational pathway from rejection in the kind of the father's own childhood to them rejecting their own children was if fathers participated in a parenting program of some sort. And we had a very crude question about this, so we don't know much about the parenting program, but this intergenerational pathway was disrupted if fathers participated in a parenting program of some sort. And so I'll talk a little bit about in a minute about some ideas for parenting programs. So UNICEF has developed standards for parenting programs in a number of different countries. This report is available online for free download. I was one of the consultants on this project, and I think there are a number of important points in thinking about parenting programs. One of the big ones is that fathers should be as included in parenting programs as mothers are. Um, if, in the research literature and parenting programs, it's much more common to focus on mothers than on fathers. And fathers, if they are included in parenting programs, often are included more, or their role is sometimes framed as helpers to mothers rather than being important in their own right. And I think that part of what the standards are doing is encouraging anyone who's a caregiver in a child's life to be fully included in parenting programs, and that certainly includes fathers. Um, Fathers tend to behave in different ways with mothers. Um, in some predictable ways, despite the messages that I was talking about with many gender similarities, there are some differences too. So, fathers, for example, are more likely to engage in rough and tumble play with their kids than mothers are. That means that rough and tumble play is things like kind of wrestling with the child or, engaging in really kind of physical games, and that's important for children's development because that can help with emotion regulation, for one thing. Um, Another way that fathers sometimes differ in terms of their parenting from mothers is in physical caregiving, sort of basic feeding and bathing and dressing. Mothers are much more likely to do those kinds of things than fathers are. But when fathers do those behaviors, that also helps to build close relationships with children. And so, countries that have policies, for example, that allow fathers as well as mothers to take paid parental leave, that's really important in fostering close relationships between fathers and young children. And fathers who take leave to parental leave shortly after the birth or adoption of a child are more likely to engage in those kinds of physical caregiving sorts of responsibilities than fathers who don't take that kind of lead. So those are a few. I think those are a few ways that fathers, in particular, can differ from mothers in their caregiving. One thing that's important in implementing parenting programs is the importance of implementation science, and I say that because implementation science is a way of taking a program and really paying attention to how it's put into practice. So, a lot of times, research will say, this particular parenting program is effective. And so let's take it to scale, even at a whole country level, without necessarily attending to how it might differ once it's taken to scale. Who's the workforce? Do additional people need to be trained to deliver the program? How will it be sustained when researchers leave? And these are questions that are important if you're thinking about taking a parenting program to scale. And then another aspect that's important here in terms of kind of implementing parenting programs is thinking about if you are going to try to target fathers, how to do that. Um, the Better Parenting program in Jordan is a really good example of this. This was a program that was meant to serve fathers as well as mothers, but the team was having a really hard time reaching fathers, and so tried to think, how can we get fathers more involved in this parenting program? And what they ended up doing is having imams deliver the program to fathers during Friday prayers, and it ended up being extremely successful because it was then respected imams who were delivering the messages, and it was in a setting where fathers were already going, and so it was. They weren't sort of having to take time out of their schedule from something else to go to a parenting program, and it ended up being a really great way to target fathers. So, those are a few thoughts about parenting programs in general, and specifically about how to target fathers in parenting programs. One of the other sustainable development goals that's guiding the international development agenda through 2030 is inclusive quality education for all. And I mention that here because in terms of gender equity in education, girls globally are still lagging behind boys in terms of access to quality education, especially when you get to um, secondary education and higher. And part of this is that even when public education is theoretically free, costs of things like uniforms and books and fees can keep students out of school. And what happens in some countries is that if families can't afford to send all of their children to school, they're oftentimes still more likely to pay to send their sons to school than their daughters to school. Um, but decreased quality of education may accompany increased access if there aren't enough trained teachers, books, and other materials. So as countries are working toward inclusive quality education for boys and girls equally, it's important to kind of think about how to maintain quality as well as increasing access. So, our Parenting Across Cultures project team published this book that was about schools and parenting in different countries, and so I think some of the important messages to come out here were that one way that parents can improve their children's school outcomes is by building bridges between the home and the school. And parents can do this in different ways. And one of the most important ways is by stressing the importance of education. And fathers can play an especially important role here in terms of stressing the importance of education, not just for their sons, but also for their daughters, and helping girls in particular to have access to education. Um, Parents can also, countries differ in terms of how involved they allow parents to be in classrooms or at schools. Um, but if school systems allow that, then parents can also sometimes be directly involved in talking with teachers or volunteering at school and things like that. Parents can also set aside a special place at home where students can do homework and hopefully it's a kind of a quiet place where students can work uninterrupted at home. And then parents can also just be involved in setting expectations and goals for children related to education. I want to, at this point, just acknowledge some of the international team that's collaborated on the Parenting Across Cultures project, and say thank you to all of these colleagues, to our funders, and to you for listening today. Our website is listed on this slide. So this website has access to um, measures that we've used in our project. It has links to papers that I was talking about, as well as other papers that I didn't touch on today. And my email address is here, so you can feel free to follow up with me by email. And that I will end there, and it leaves us plenty of time for questions and discussion. So please, I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Lansford. We have some questions for you here. But before asking them, I would like to ask my question first.
Sure.
Being a moderator, I use my advantage of asking the first question. And when you were talking about these parenting programs about fathers, and was that again the same for all countries, all these 9 countries who had these kind of parenting programs? They acted more warmer, or I should say warmer or affectionate or understandingly. Was that the same for all countries?
It was the same. We did not find differences across countries in that. So that finding was the same, that fathers who reported having participated in a parenting program reported being more warm and loving with their child, and that it also disrupted this intergenerational link. So even if a father, and this was true across the 9 countries, even if a father reported remembering that his own father and mother had been rejecting of him when he was a child, he was less likely to be rejecting of his own child if he'd participated in a parenting program.
We have to try this as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have some more questions. And
Okay.
question one is, how do cultural differences shape fatherhood and father and son relationships? Are there universal patterns?
Yeah. So I think culture has a role there largely in terms of norms about how involved fathers are expected to be in child rearing. So there are some cultural contexts that still expect mothers to be the primary caregivers and be the most involved in parenting, and that fathers are even a little bit of outsiders sometimes, so that the mother-child relationship is the primary relationship, and then fathers are not as directly involved in caring for the child, and their main role would be sort of supporting the mother. In other cultural contexts, there are norms that have changed, especially over the last couple of decades, that fathers are expected to take a more active role in direct caregiving of children. And so I think one of the main ways that culture affects fathers' role is just by setting norms, so that fathers are likely to behave in ways that are consistent with norms in the broader culture. Um, in terms of specifically how fathers react or interact with girls versus boys, cultural norms also play a role there too. So in some cultures, fathers are expected, for example, to that fathers are more likely, I should say, to be involved in socializing their children around gender than mothers are. So there's a little bit um, of work that mothers tend to treat their children more similarly than fathers do, and that fathers, especially, are more likely to socialize their sons to be sort of um, kind of aligned with whatever the gender expectations are in their cultural context. So I hope that addressed the question.
Thank you. Another question is how does that intergenerational violence or violent behavior uh, is changed, but how do you measure this after the
Yeah,
parenting program, I believe? Yes.
yeah. So our measures of parent to child violence are based on two different measures. One is the conflict tactics scale. And that is a measure that was developed in the 1970s. So it's been around for a long time. And it asks parents how often they have used a number of different forms of discipline. Some of them are not violent. So some of them would be things like offering explanations or, like explaining to the child while something's wrong or helping the child to make amends. Those would be nonviolent forms of discipline. But then the conflict tactics scale also asks how often parents have spanked the child, um, kind of with their bare hand, hit the child with an object. It asks about different kinds of violence in that way. We also use a measure that was developed by UNICEF for the multiple indicator cluster surveys, and it asks about 11 different forms of discipline, and they're just yes, no. Did you or anyone in your household use this form of discipline with the child in the last 30 days? And it includes things like hitting the child on the face, hitting the child on the extremities, um, um, things like that. So that's the main way we've measured violence in our work. There are other studies that have looked at intergenerational violence that use reports of abuse to Child Protective Services, for example. Things that have come to the attention of authorities. We did not do that in our work, but there is other work on intergenerational transmission of violence that's used those kinds of um, cases reported to authorities.
That's another data. Thank you. And it seems that we are all interested with the similar things. And one of the questions here is could you please tell us more about the parenting program for fathers?
Yeah. So there's a range of different parenting programs that have been used, and so in our work we didn't get a lot of information about what the parenting programs for fathers had been. So I'll talk here about just in general some different kinds of parenting programs that have been used with fathers as well as with mothers. There are some of the best known ones are called Triple P. That's an evidence based program. There's something called the Incredible Years project. There are a number of different other ones. And if you wanted to email me, I could send you kind of a list of several different evidence-based parenting programs. The Better Parenting program in Jordan is the one that I was mentioning, was delivered by imams during Friday prayers to fathers. And that involved a lot of kind of talking to fathers about the important role they play in the family, not just supporting their wives, but also in their own right. It talked about using nonviolent forms of discipline. And part of that, I think, that is important in parenting programs that have talked about using nonviolent forms of discipline. The message is not just you shouldn't hit your kids or you shouldn't be violent with your kids. It's also education about what parents should do instead. And so typically the advice in these parenting programs about what parents should do instead is things, it depends on the age of the child. So for example, for infants and toddlers, oftentimes distraction is the best thing that parents can do. Because infants and toddlers don't yet have the cognitive capacity to understand that what they're doing is wrong. And so usually if a parent can just redirect the infant or toddler, that's good. Parents are oftentimes also taught about using other forms of discipline like timeouts or manipulating privileges is a nonviolent alternative. And on the positive side, also taught about the importance of using proactive forms of discipline. Like, so before going into a situation that might be especially tricky for kids, to say, these are my expectations. This is how you should behave in this situation, to try to prevent misbehavior before it starts. But if misbehavior does happen, then some of these parenting programs would also talk about the importance of explaining to children why what they did was wrong. Talking to children about, how would you feel if your brother did this to you, is a way of helping build empathy and compassion. And so some of those things have been incorporated into parenting programs with fathers about forms of discipline. I hope that helps.
Thank you. I think one more question, Emma, just one more question is, how can parenting programs and educational policies be designed to better engage fathers in their children's learning, especially in societies with strong traditional gender roles?
That's a great question. I think some of it, I think there are a few different things. One is that there can be even public awareness campaigns. And part of that would just be sort of planting the idea that fathers can play an important role in these things, with the idea that norms sometimes take time to change. Some of it can be who the messenger is. I think the example of the imams delivering the message, I think, is a good one, because these are respected people who are saying to fathers, it's important to be more involved in child rearing. It's important to take care of your child in these ways. And so I think it's important to think about who the messenger is as well, especially in cultural contexts with more traditional gender roles. And then I think sometimes sometimes these parenting programs almost function as a support group in a sense. So if fathers are brought together and can learn from each other, and also see that there are other men who are striving to be more involved in their children's lives, that can also help fathers to become more engaged in parenting.
Thank you. Thank you. It was wonderful. And dear friends of Enstitü Sosyal, we were together with Professor Dr. Jennifer Lansford with our Global Reflection series this evening. And it was a pleasure to listen to you and learn about your commitments to family. We enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much. and we hope to carry our relations with you. Just one more questions at the last time. It's again the parenting programs for fathers, and now this time, you think the father's fulfillment of their parenting duties is directly related to culture? Just one more question, and a minute, so we can talk about that. Is it related to culture and environmental factors they live in?
I think so, yes. So I think this is one of the ways that culture plays a big role in family life, is by kind of giving people norms that they witness in their environment, and then are likely to shape their own behaviors as fathers or mothers or boys or girls in relation to norms relating to gender in the culture.
Thank you very much, Professor Lansford. Now it's your time to go on your day. And this was a good food for thought session for us. And for us now, it's time for food for stomach. Uh, Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.